Hello, my name is Larry Schneider. I'm an architect here in the state of Florida, and I specialize in accessibility consulting. I've been involved in the accessibility code since 1990 and just have watched it evolve and go on. We're here today to present to you the ABCs of the new ADA and the Florida Accessibility Code Advanced Building Code course. This will give you 2 hours of credit on the new Florida Accessibility Code for your renewal of your license here in the state of Florida. The materials that you have before you are copyrighted. They are materials, and so therefore they're for the use of this presentation only. The learning objectives today are to deal with the session will address the updating the new 2010 ADA standards and the revised Florida Accessibility Code for building construction, which is now the official accessibility code for the state of Florida. The ADA is not just for wheelchair users, walkers, crutches, and canes, people who are visually impaired, hearing impaired, vertically challenged, like that. So it covers all kinds of disabilities, or even arthritic hands and stuff like that, dealing with accessibility. So it's not just chair users. That's probably one of the chair user space is probably one of the bigger ones for the impact, but again, not just that. Let's talk about my good friend Dilbert. Dilbert here is talking to his mom, and they're having a nice discussion. Well, as usual, I worked until midnight last night, Mom. Well, at least you made some extra money. I don't get paid for overtime. Well, at least it was important work. Not really. My boss made me change my PowerPoint slides, but the changes made them worse. Well, at least you're well prepared for your meeting. It was canceled. But that's okay because the project isn't funded anyways. So, you work for free to worsen a presentation for a meeting that won't happen for a project that doesn't exist. Yet, you must be a design professional, i.e. you must be an architect, and I know you've all worked on that project. Also, our presentation here to help you is hopefully not let this happen to you. We hate to see you lose your Porsche Boxer. Can you imagine this? Look at this license plate. Was his. That's kind of a gutsy ad for a law firm, isn't it? Kind of interesting. Also, we don't want you to feel like this guy. Imagine this guy's job. Here you are holding the target being shot at. There are probably a bunch of you who feel that this happens to you every day, dealing in the design profession, but we want to take care of you for that portion of it as it relates to accessibility. Also, putting a sign like this up that says, "Watch your step, ADA says this ramp ain't right," that really is not going to bail you out from accessibility. You really need to take care of those issues for compliance. Now, compliance with the ADA. ADA is not the American Dental Association, even though you might Google it and take a look at it. We're talking about the Americans with Disabilities Act. Now, in dealing with accessibility, one of the places that you can go for technical assistance is the Access Board. Great website, a lot of good information there. They have a technical assistance number. You can call them up at 1-800-USA-ABLE and get technical assistance. Now, they're only going to give you technical assistance on the ADA, not on the Florida Accessibility Code. They know all the fun stuff about the Florida Code and our specific challenges that we have here in Florida, but they're only going to talk to you about the federal, and it might give you some good insight, but look at their website for good clarification and information. Compliance issues and updates. The ADA is based upon the 2004 Access Board's guidelines standards, and the new ADA became effective March 15th, 2012. IRS. Why is Larry talking to you about the IRS? Well, we need to let you know that there is some help for accessibility dealing with the IRS. But also I want you to be aware of, we've taken a hard look at this as CNN this morning, and CNN has proposed and given us information from the government as it relates to how they're going to handle the federal deficit. And they've created a new tax form for all of us, and here it is. This is the IRS 1040 easy to do tax form. It's very simplified. How much money did you make? Send it to us. That's the new way, that's the new bailout in taking care of the deficit for all of us. No, really. Why am I talking to you about the IRS? Tax Form 8826. Tax Form 8826 is a form that a business owner can get a tax credit for doing things for accessibility compliance at their property, i.e. removing barriers. And they are supposed to be doing that. In fact, they should have been doing that since 1992. So here's the tax form you could pass on to your client and probably maybe even help you out in getting some work and saying, hey, let me come to your property, let's do an accessibility evaluation. let's see what you need to do for accessibility, and you get a tax credit to do these things. Another good place to go look at is the U.S. Department of Justice. The DOJ, great website, a lot of good information in dealing with accessibility. Go there to get their information. Here's the 1991 standards. Now, there are two sets of standards that have been identified by the Department of Justice. The 1991 ADA standards, which is the old ones, and that book has a complimentary commentary dealing with accessibility, and this is it. So anything that dealt with that book, there's a code commentary on that. If you can get your hands on one of this, it's a good book to have as a reference. Now, dealing with the ADA, you need to know ADA is not a building code. It's a federal civil rights law. Access per the building code still applies, but this deals with accessibility. ADA rarely applies to housing projects, which is fair housing in Section 504, but it could be depending on how certain parts of your facility are being used, i.e. a rental project, apartment complex. Your clubhouse, if you turn the clubhouse into the rental office, guess what? You're now a public accommodation and you need to comply with the Florida Accessibility Code here in Florida. ADA facility compliance affects new construction, alterations, barrier removal, facilities for existing facilities. So in dealing with that, you need to look at the requirements for the Florida Accessibility Code. The 2010 ADA requirements, the department has adopted the revised ADA design standards and they've added to them in making things for accessibility. So the important part is March 15th, 2012, we have a new ADA and we also have a new Florida Accessibility Code. This presentation is really going to be based on the requirements of the Florida Accessibility Code and their requirements. We're going to be bouncing back and forth a little bit with some things for the ADA, so you're aware of it if you're practicing outside of Florida, but we're going to be looking mainly at the Florida-specific items. So, the 2010 ADA standards. Here it is, copy of the book. You can download this from the Department of Justice. I strongly recommend you do that so you have a copy for yourself. Actually, there's 4 books that you can get from the Department of Justice. Download them, they're PDF files, keep them on your computer, print them out, get a hard copy, keep it in your office. Good reference document for information. There is the guidance on the 2010 ADA standards, i.e. it's a code commentary. But guess what that also means here in Florida? Since the Florida Accessibility Code is based on the 2010 ADA standards, they are then guidance for the Florida Accessibility Code requirements. So you could use this kind of book right here in helping you out in addressing Florida Accessibility Code requirements that are matching up with the federal. There's a new format on the 2010 ADA standards. If you've been using ANSI A117.1, you've seen that new format. In Florida, it's a totally whole new piece. So we're dealing with that. So the old Florida code, like Section 464 dealing with parking, that's no longer the same. Parking is in a whole new section in dealing with that. So be aware, new section numbers, so you're going to need to change all your references as it relates to pieces of the Florida Accessibility Code. Under ADA Title II, the requirement is program accessibility. And I want to talk to you a little bit about the safe harbor in dealing with program accessibility and under Title II, and also the same thing under Title III. But let's talk Title II, which is governmental facilities in dealing with accessibility. In dealing with that, you need to make your program accessible. So if you've got a whole bunch of different things going on, let's say you got a county that has a bunch of parks. Well, under ADA, you don't need to make every park accessible. You need to make the program accessible. Now, if you have a park that's very unique and say it has a bocce court, guess what? You're going to make that park accessible. A lot of parks all have basketball courts. Now, the question everybody asks is, well, how many parks do I have to make accessible? That's a tummy check. I'm big in my tummy check. If you take a long section, you take like this screen, and let's pretend that this is a county, you know, divide it up into squares and stuff like that and kind of put your parks in different areas. Do the larger parks because you kind of capture everything. The other part is very important to know is about the safe harbor. In dealing with the safe harbor, if it met the 1991 ADA standards, you don't have to change it to meet the 2010 ADA standards or the 2012 Florida Accessibility Code. As an example, and this is probably one of the big ones. You all have learned that the reach range for something on the side is 54 inches. That number is gone. The maximum reach range is 48. So everything is now 48 inches high. You go into an existing building and you see a thermostat at 54 inches or a fire alarm pole box at 54. You don't have to drop it down to 48 because you met the safe harbor of the existing code. Now, the readily achievable barrier removal under Title III, which is public accommodations, hotels, motels, restaurants, office buildings, things like that. A public accommodation shall remove architectural barriers in existing facilities, including communication barriers that are readily achievable. And that's defined, as we said, easily accomplishable and able to be carried out with much difficulty or expense. Now, everyone always asks the questions, well, how much is how much? I'm going to give you the famous answer. It depends. You got to take a look at it. If a business is not doing well, then you don't have the dollars. But you got to remember, ADA came effective in 1992. We're here now today, 20 years later plus. So you've had lots of time to do barrier removal in dealing with a project. In dealing with the barrier removal, you have the same thing about the safe harbor exception. The other big example I can give you is in a toilet room. Let's go into a single-user toilet room. You know from the toilet had to be 18 inches off the wall. Let you know that number's changed, and we're going to talk about that. But then you take the lavatory and you put it beside it. That was only 18 inches from the center line of the toilet to the edge of the lav, which meant 36 inches off the wall. The new ADA, the new Florida Accessibility Code for building construction, has now said from the wall to the edge of that lavatory is now 60 inches. So there's 42 inches between the center line of the toilet and the side of the lavatory. No more 18, which meant you had to change every toilet room if you had to meet the new standards. And that's where the feds came up with the idea of the safe harbor idea and said, as long as you met the safe harbor, the requirements of the old code, you were in compliant, you're okay. And so you need to do an element by element evaluation in dealing with this, in dealing with the safe harbor issues and the path of travel. Here's some examples. There's requirements that are new in the ADA, in the new Florida Accessibility Code, that were really never covered under the safe harbor or the 1991 ADA standards. And here's a couple of them. Recreational boating, fishing piers, mini golf, saunas, firing range, bowling lanes, exercise equipment, golf facilities. Can you imagine a golf facility making it a golf course fully accessible? Well, it doesn't mean you go change the whole golf course. It just means you have a riding cart. You need a tee box that's accessible. Golf carts can actually drive on the green and stuff like that. And the big hot button out there is swimming pools. Under the new ADA and the new Florida Accessibility Code, you are required to provide access into the swimming pool. No longer just get you to the water's edge, you've got to get people into the pool. So this shopping list here, these are new items that were never scoped under the old 1991 standards and now need to comply. So there is no safe harbor for these issues. Again, as I said, if you met the 91 standards, there's no further retrofitting is required to reflect the changes in the 2010 standards. New construction meets the ADA standards and the Florida Accessibility Code. Alterations meets the new construction standards to the maximum extent feasible, and the path of travel requirements can expand the plan scope of a building project. Biggest issue that we see out there all the time is people do an alteration to a building. There's a thing called the 20% rule, and people forget that 20% of your alteration needs to be spent on accessibility compliance. So when you're doing a project in Florida, you got to think about your alteration, and then you got to think about what you're doing for accessibility. And we'll talk a little bit later on about that. The path of travel, and here's that disproportionate cost that I was just talking about. DOJ says means no more than 20% of the cost of the overall alteration. So let's say you got a project that your client is telling you is going to cost $100,000. Well, you need to tell that client, no, wait a minute, 20% of that needs to go maybe towards accessibility. So maybe your project is not going to be $100,000, it's going to be $80,000. 20% of 80,000 is 16,000. There's 80 and 16, that gets you to 96,000. You just saved your client $4,000. See if you can split it with them. Maybe you can work out a deal and get some bucks out of the deal. But be careful about this alteration and the 20% requirement. The path of travel, a continuous unobstructed way of pedestrian passage by means of which the altered area may be approached, entered, and exited. This also includes, for these alterations, restrooms, payphones, drinking fountains serving the area. There we go. 20% is based on the alterations in the last 3 years. There's a priority. There's a recommended priority in dealing with this. Basically, look at it this way. Get me into the building, provide me access to goods and services, and let me get to the bathroom. That's your path. That's usually your choices, and that kind of makes sense. So they talk about accessible entrance, accessible route, at least one accessible restroom, then telephones, drinking fountains, and then other elements. Main point, can I get into the building? Landlord or tenant issues, very important to let you know. Landlord or tenant, the path of never buy your teeth at Sears, they just don't fit all the time. Path of travel, generally if tenants are altering their own lease space, there is no duty on the landlord to remove architectural barriers in the common use spaces outside the tenant's lease space under the path of travel. To let you know, there's a declaratory statement in the state of Florida on this specific issue that says if I am doing an alteration to a tenant space in an office building, only the tenant space is required to be made accessible. I don't start going outside and looking at the common area bathrooms. I don't look at the elevator if it's a multi-story building. I don't look about getting into the building. I just worry about the tenant space. Landlord-tenant, very important issue. And like I said, there is a declaratory statement issued by the Florida Building Commission to address this issue and to clarify it if you ever run into this problem with a building official here in Florida. Service animal. I just had to throw this in there because I just couldn't believe this. I found this interesting. Service animal basically before meant almost anything. I've actually been on a flight where a woman had a snake as her service animal. She preferred, it made her feel comfortable. And she would get a little nervous on the plane. She got nervous on this flight, so she, out of her bag, she takes the snake and wraps it around her neck. Now, the guy sitting next to her kind of freaks out. But this was her, quote, service animal. I've actually seen people use crickets because they like the noise of the crickets. They make me feel comfortable. So they've clarified what a service animal is. It is basically a dog. Other species of animals, whether wild or domestic, trained or untrained, are not service animals for the purpose of this definition. The criminal deterrent efforts of an animal's presence in the provision of emotional support, well-being, comfort, or companionship do not constitute work or task definitions. So in other words, if you have the big Rottweiler walking with you, that's not a service animal if it's for a criminal deterrent. Now, however, the feds have said miniature horses are a service animal. And everyone freaks out about miniature horses and going, what? Now, I recently became a grandfather, so this is kind of neat. My wife has already told me this is a great way to buy my granddaughter a pony. I can claim it as my service animal, which would be kind of fun. And you're probably saying, why in the world, Larry, are they thinking about miniature horses? There's two big reasons in regards to it. One, there are people who are allergic to dog hair, who need a service animal. The second is, miniature horses live longer than dogs. So that's the two real reasons why it's a miniature horse. Now, you've got to be careful about this. You've got to make sure in dealing about the type, size, and weight of the miniature horse, whether it's housebroken, all those other kind of fun things. So just let you know, next time if you see me walking around with a miniature horse, it's my service animal. I just want you to know that. You know, you got to have its housebroken, like I said, the size of it, and it's got to be under control. Here's the Florida Accessibility Code for Building Construction. This is the binder for the book. It says 2010. In reality, it's the 2012. This guy right here. Now, I printed this out myself. That's why you see it. But I want you to be aware of the fact that it is a 2012 Florida Accessibility Code. That's what you're dealing with. It happens to be in all the binders of the 2010 Florida Building Code. In dealing with all of this, the 2012 requirements, there's some exceptions of the federal standards in dealing with the parts of it. There used to be about 17 items that are Florida specific, that are above and beyond the federal. What we were able to do during the process of upgrading to the new 2012 is we dumped over half of those. And we've cleaned them out a lot. And so there are certain ones that are important for the disabled community in Florida, and these are some of those. The exterior door still stays in Florida of 8.5 pounds. Okay, that's still an issue that's still out there. In hotels and motels, the number of rooms equaling at least 5% of the guest rooms. So 5% of the guest rooms under Florida law are required to be made accessible, and these are the only 3 items that deal with those requirements. Grab bars, all beds, open frame, and we've changed this. It used to say a water closet that you provide a donut, which is a raised seat. The problem was you could never find it. So when we were working through this process, we agreed just put in a high toilet. So what you're going to put in is one of the accessible toilets 17 to 19 inches above the floor. And that's above and beyond the base requirement for accessible rooms. In bathing rooms and toilet rooms, in new construction, and this is really important to know, in new construction, you are required to put a lavatory in the accessible toilet stall. It's not required under an alteration because the law specifically says new construction. So you've got to put that lab in the stall. The other part to let you know, when you weed through the Florida Accessibility Code, you will say if there's more than one fixture in the accessible toilet stall, you need to have one accessible out in the common area. Guess what that means? You will be providing an accessible lavatory in the common area. Now most plumbers we're starting to see and installers are making all the labs at 34 inches. So it's not a big deal, but it's your apron. You got to be careful about your apron in the common area. So be aware of that one coming up. The toilet also needs to be diagonally across from you. Can't put it in front of the door unless you've got a really big room. But if you take a typical stall that you're going to create, it needs to be diagonally across so you can get in there and maneuver around. Another important part in dealing with that, because there are 2 fixtures in the accessible toilet stall, the code now says you need a 5-foot turnaround inside that stall. So just be careful. That can catch you if you're not careful with it. Parking spaces. There must be one accessible parking space in the immediate vicinity of a public owned or leased building. There must be one accessible parking space for each 150 metered on-street parking spots. All spaces must be located on an accessible route that is at least 44 inches wide so that users are not compelled to walk or wheel behind parked vehicles. And we added this text, except behind his or her own vehicle. There was always a debate, and we all knew that what it meant was you can go behind your own car, but you can't go behind another person's car. Now, we tried to get 2 cars done in the process, but it didn't work out, so this was the compromise in dealing with it. So basically what this is telling you, from the parking space to the front door, you need a 44-inch path to travel. You need an accessible route that's at least 44 inches wide. So that's what you're going to have to be doing here in Florida. Florida's parking spaces are 12-foot wide. They're a minimum of 12-foot wide, and you need a 5-foot access aisle. So just be aware of that. You don't need the van accessible parking sign in Florida for accessible parking spaces that are open. Guess what? They're all van accessible. What's a van spot under the ADA? 11 and 5, 16 feet. What's Florida's? 12 and 5, 17. Therefore, they're all van accessible, and there is no requirement to provide the van sign because they're all going to be accessible. Space must be posted with a permanent above grade sign, and the thing is now, Florida's code used to say 84 inches. We've changed it to harmonize with the federal law. It's 60 inches minimum to the bottom of the sign. So now, again, one of the processes in eliminating a lot of these things that were in the Florida statute was trying to harmonize the Florida Accessibility Code with the federal requirements. And the removal of architectural barriers from a parking facility in accordance with 28 CFR must comply with this section unless compliance would cause the barrier removal not to be readily achievable. So we've put kind of that stuff in there in dealing with parking, because you're dealing with existing facilities. You might have a problem in getting things to work out. And sometimes that means, okay, you do what's readily achievable. An example I can give you is parking close by, and you might have too much of a slope. But if you go across the driveway, it could be flat. Now I provided the accessible parking. It's not right by the building, but that's a readily achievable solution versus tearing up a parking lot. A facility that is making alterations under 553507, that's part of the Florida statute, must comply with this section to the maximum extent feasible. In other words, we're dealing with alterations and stuff like that. You're doing the best you can. And that's right from the statute. Also, if you're dealing with a local jurisdiction that says, okay, we like our parking spots 15 feet wide and a 6-foot access aisle, wrong answer, because the statute says this act expressly preempts the establishment of handicap accessibility standards to the state and supersedes any county or municipal ordinance. So basically what they're telling you is the Florida Accessibility Code is a mini-maxi code. No local jurisdiction can add to it. No local jurisdiction can take away from it. So some people might say, we want these following things to be this way in our area. No, Florida Statute 553.513 says this is it. This is all you do. This was a part that has already passed. We've already dealt with it, but so we won't get into it. But basically what it was saying was you could have used the 2010 ADA until March 15th. If you wanted to do it for a project. The Florida Accessibility Code is in process of getting approved by the Department of Justice. We're still waiting to hear about the justification. Last time I checked into it, they got some questions and there's discussion going back and forth between the Florida Building Commission and the Department of Justice. We don't know when this is going to happen, so just be aware we're working on getting it certified. Now, a waiver. The Florida Building Commission may waive Florida-specific requirements of this code. It does not waive requirements of this code to standards below the federal. So, in dealing with a waiver, if you're going for a waiver from the Florida Accessibility Code, you can only get it from the Florida-specific. And one of the base Florida-specific ones is you need vertical accessibility to every level. If you do an alteration to a building, you need to put vertical access into the building. Then you fall under the 20% rule. Under the 20% rule, the cost of an elevator tends to get prohibitive, but you have to go for a waiver process to get this done. If you're totally into self-abuse, you can give me a call, send me an email, I don't mind. Do this, I've been doing this kind of pro bono, answering questions since 1992. If we get into a big discussion in dealing with all this, then we're going to talk about serious shop. We're going to talk about lunch, dinner, bottle of wine, round of golf, things like that. So, but I don't mind answering questions for people. Tools of the trade, some basic things. There is an ADA tape measure out there that has the entire accessibility code on the tape. If you want to get one of those and have lots of fun. I stole from the old school. I've upgraded this. I no longer do tapes on the micro cassettes because you can't buy them anymore. So I've now gone to a digital recorder out there. It's interesting. I went to replace the tapes and they said, no, nobody sells them anymore. They're still out there, but you got to find them. And the smart tool, which is the leveling device, and taking a look at it. So things you need to do if you're dealing with accessibility. Okay, you need a tape measure at least 25 feet long. So you can measure the parking spots. Okay, so you want that one there. The leveling device, the smart tool, buy the 24-inch one. That's what the feds use. That's what everyone, all the documents they publish saying, buy the 24-inch one, calibrate it, and set it up. The crazy part, I've actually had people dealing with this. I want you to know it solves the debate in the field real quick. I've actually had a person do this to me. Gone out to the field, kind of rocked back and forth, and said, this feels about 6.7%. How do you do that? You got something on your ankles? Take the smart tool, it's out there, it's done. The door pressure gauge, the last time I looked at it, the price was 30 bucks. That's for pushing and pulling on a door. It's the best one out there that I know of. A lot of people use fish scales and stuff like that. and obviously a digital camera. Take pictures. With today's technology, pictures are the best thing. You can see everything you need to know. If you want to get the Florida Accessibility Code, first of all, you can get it, you can look at it online. Here's the link on it that you can go, and it's a PDF view only. The printed versions are shipped out there. The CD-ROM is available, so you can get that for yourself right now. You can order the Florida Accessibility Code from two choices, ICC or the Building Officials Association of Florida. That's your two choices. My recommendation, go to BOAF. This is the web page. If you go to floridabuilding.org, www.floridabuilding.org, this is the web page that you get to, and if you notice it says 2012 Florida Accessibility Code, Florida law, the amended law, and they have a little paragraph in there, the changes in the law. Some good information for you if you want to go looking on that. The equivalent facilitation. There's still a part in there that you can say, what's equivalent? Nothing in these requirements prevent the usage of designs, products, or technologies as alternatives to design, which is what the building codes always had, alternate design solutions. So you can go to that. Let's take a look at specific things in the Florida Accessibility Code in dealing with it. Okay? Again, we talked about it. We got the old books that came out. We got the 2010 ADA standards, which is the basis of the Florida Accessibility Code, and it all became effective March 15th. So dealing with that, you're dealing with the building permit date. Here we are at this point in time. We're already past that date. So everything should be dealing with that code section. The additional DOJ added requirements to the 2004 Access Board's guidelines. Social service center establishments, housing at places of education, assembly areas, medical care, residential dwelling that's covered by the ADA, detention and correction facilities. So those of you who do get incarcerated, you will know you will have an accessible stall and cell to be in if you want to get there. And they've clarified some things about places of lodging. The ADA standards are for DOT. DOT has done their own standards. They've taken the federal ones and they've added to it. As an example, under the new Florida Accessibility Code, there is no requirement for detectable warnings. They're gone. Okay, detectable warnings are now gone on private property. And folks, we've been putting them up all over the place. We've seen them in places they should not be. They're there. DOT has said you will provide detectable warnings. So what does that mean? Roadways and streets, you're going to provide detectable warnings. Once you turn off the road and you go onto the property, guess what? No more detectable warnings. So the revisions in DOT's location of accessible routes, we just talked about the detectable warnings. Bus boarding and alignment areas, these are these sections. So these four sections that you see on the right side of the screen, that's where DOT has added things to it. So if you're dealing with their kind of projects, be aware of their standards. With the Access Board, again, there's their web page to get information. Lots and lots of good stuff there. As we mentioned earlier, the harmonization between the International Building Code and ANSI, keep going. We're obviously into a newer version of the International Building Code, and that's coming up with the newer versions of the ANSI standards. There is a side-by-side comparison, if anyone was curious, with about the new ADA, the DOJ, and the IBC. If you want to download this, I promise you if you start reading it, it's a good thing to help put you to sleep. We'll put you right out real quick. Let's talk about some of the things in Chapter 1. Dimensions. There's a range. Our famous one was the toilet, 18 inches off the wall. Guess what? That's now gone to a range, 16 to 18. So guess what? You're going to make your toilets off the side wall at 17 inches now. Just dimension it at 17. Therefore, you've already put it in the middle. You've taken care of that. There's construction and manufacturing tolerances in there, and the figures are basically informational. The text rules what's going on here. So here's a range. As I said, the toilet is now 16 to 18 inches. The ambulatory stall, okay, for the walkers, crutches, and canes, had to be 36 inches. It's now 35 to 37. they've got a range. So everything has gone into ranges, so it makes this easier as a designer. You know, pick the middle one in the middle, and you got it covered. There are some absolute dimensions about this transfer shower, a 36 by 36 shower. This is the shower with the shower bench. And the whole reason for the 36 by 36 is ergonomics. When a person sits down on that seat, can they reach all the controls? You don't make it bigger because you think it's nicer, because then you can't reach anything. You don't make it deeper because then you got this leap of faith between the edge of the shower and the bench to get to it. Grab bars. It always was 1.5 inches, and they wrote an opinion way back in 1994 that says 2 inch, 1.5 inches nominal, which is really 1.9 inches. So they've clarified that, but that distance off the wall for a grab bar is 1.5 inches. Not handrails, grab bars, different animal. Okay, let's talk about some things in Chapter 2. New construction, all areas must comply except exempted structures, work areas, and partially scoped spaces. As an example, a medical care suite. The mechanical room is exempt. Just approach, enter, and exit. Now they've added a new piece about toilet rooms, which is really important. If you cluster toilet rooms, you need to have at least 50% of them now accessible, not all of them. And they define clustering, as you can see here, these three. That means I could stand right here in the middle and see them all. And I can determine the accessible one. So for these three, I need 2 of them to be accessible. I've got these guys over here on this side. I got 4 of them over here. I need 2 to be accessible. Clustering, big change in the code. Some general exceptions are construction sites, some raised areas, like an airport traffic control tower, that's exempt. Things like that. Single occupant structures, toll booths. In Florida, we do have toll booths in the Northeast. You got the toll booths where you walk down below and pop up. Well, you don't need to make those accessible. Those of you who like to watch wrestling, there were some people concerned about, does a wrestling ring have to be made accessible? Guess what? It's exempt. So you're not going to see some interesting wrestling, but if you want to watch it, raised boxing and wrestling rings are exempt. Okay, there we go. Minimum requirements for work areas: approach, enter, and exit. Can I come to the front door? Can I approach it? Can I enter it? And can I exit? Which means I can just get right in. And that's what this slide is telling you. Can I approach it, enter it, exit? That's it. That's all I need for a work area, for accessibility. Circulation paths. There are some exceptions. Under areas under 1,000 square feet, the path of travel is different. Paths equal the integral part of the equipment, getting around the office space. So when I do this open office plan, accessible path of travel in dealing with that. Areas under 300 square feet that are elevated at least 7 inches as an essential function condition of the space, they're excluded. Except for courtroom stations. Courtrooms, you need to make those accessible. So there's certain work areas that are exempt. In dealing with alterations, Florida law says the architectural barrier removal under 36304 from buildings or facilities shall comply with the requirements of the law unless compliance would not be readily achievable. So be aware of Florida specific requirements. It kind of kicks you back to the federal requirements. Under the alterations, you standard apply based upon the planned scope of the work, technical feasibility, and primary function areas. There's limited alterations, standards apply element by element, so you're taking a look at that. So when you're doing an alteration, you've got to take a look at that and your famous 20% rule. As an example, here's an alteration. Standards apply to those things being altered. The mirror, toilet, like grab bars, something like that. If I'm doing the whole space, then I'm taking a look at what needs to be done for accessibility under alterations. There's a part that's technically in feasibility under an alteration. So if I'm into a space and I can't really do it, maybe some column structural elements or something like that, that now defines it as technically infeasible. Here's some limitations of space. Okay, I've got some stuff, but I got a minimum means of egress to get out here. So I've got to be careful to make sure I can't get too big, because now I'm going to have a problem using my accessible path of travel. Where renovation equals more extensive, technically infeasible equals less likely. If you're spending a lot of dollars, the technical infeasibility kind of starts dropping down the food chain. So alterations is a case-by-case determination based on existing constraints and the compliance requirements to the maximum extent feasible. Additional requirements for alterations to areas containing a primary function. Okay, let's take a classroom, a school like that. Office building, a bank. What's the primary function of the bank? Going into the bank area to the tellers. So I got the tellers, the lobby area, the check writing things. If you're altering a bank, you need to make those things accessible. Path of travel, the accessible route from the street, points, restrooms, phones, drinking fountains. Again, we talked about that a little bit earlier about this path of travel. So I'm coming in here from the street, coming in, getting to access the building, getting to my primary function of this facility. Compliance requirements except where disproportionate to the project cost more than that 20%. There's that 20% number again. That's where the feds, as you saw earlier in the presentation, dealing with up to 20%. That's all you're required to be spending when you do that alteration. The building blocks. Now in chapter 3, what they did is they took all the things that you basically have to do for something, and the intent was say it only once for an issue versus bouncing all around and saying it 3 or 4 times. A turning space. They've clarified that. The turning space in a toilet room can overlap the lavatory. Okay, you can swing underneath it. It does work. Turning space. You're permitted an overlap limited to one arm of a T-shape. Here's a T-turn. Guess what? I can come under there, and that's part of the T-turn. T-turn, circle, 60-inch diameter. They're both the same. So here I am. Remember, I was there. I backed up, and then I head on out. The reach ranges. The side reaches we talked about went from 54 down to 48. So that's the magic number. Just think about just doing everything now at 48 inches high. Same as a forward. Operable parts. Are operable parts accessible? And are they within the reach range? Here we are, fire extinguisher cabinet. That's an operable part. Person can open the fire extinguisher, so that means that pull can be no higher than 48 inches to get to it. Clear floor space underneath it. This got changed. If you remember, under lavatories, you had to have a 29-inch clear opening underneath it from the ground to the bottom of the apron. But a table was 27. Everyone kept asking the question, why is there a 2-inch difference? Guess what? Now everything is 27 inches to the bottom of going underneath it. This is probably the best slide, and take a look at this really closely. This is what's telling you for the knee and toes. You need 8 inches minimum underneath, 27 inches minimum on the height. So there's that 8 inches. Then the toe space is at least 9 inches, and back in here. So you got all of these dimensions in here. So this is 9 inches high, at least 6 inches maximum, so the person in a chair can get their leg to fit in underneath. Great. This is a great graphic to help you get through underneath something. Okay, and deal. Now, if the space gets bigger, you can go up to 25 inches, but the additional depth must be provided for full knee clearance. But it's 25 inches maximum. Once you go beyond that, no one cares. So you don't worry about all these other pieces. Protruding objects, still the same stuff. 4 inches maximum off a wall, 80 inches to the top. This is where we tend to see a lot of challenges. People tend to forget about doing the stairs. Now, you put a handrail underneath there, what do most people wind up doing? They do the handrail at 36 inches. Now the handrail becomes a protruding object. So you want to drop that railing down. Because the cane, the person with the cane, the magic number that they determine is 27 inches maximum. And so that's where you want to put that down. My recommendation, don't get hung up on 27, drop it down to 24. Because the guy who's core drilling the slab or whatever, putting the handrails in, guess what? He might not put them down far enough. You're not down far enough, you're non-compliant. You put them down at 24, you've already built in a tolerance for the person to take care of it. Here's an example. This is at an airport. Guess what? This is a protruding object. That right there is at 27 inches where the phone was. But now all these other pieces are higher. The two legs for the stanchion are further than 12 inches apart. That's a protruding object in this airport. We are still putting up fire extinguisher cabinets on the wall. They are normally a protruding object because they're 5 inches deep. Recess them in or put them in the corners. Big one that gets missed all the time, the high-low drinking fountain. Okay? You know the low one's here at 27 inches. Well, if that's at 27 at the low one, there's no way that the high one can be at lower than 27. It makes the high one a protruding object. So what do? That's why we recess them back in. Now this facility, they didn't recess them. What they did is they added the grab bars on either side, so you hit the bars before you get into it. Could you have solved it another way? Yeah, recessed them into the wall. Done the little alcove. There's the stairs. Okay? Making sure you got that handrail at the right height. They even added a lower one here. Very kind of decorative, neat kind of design. Stops you from going underneath the stairs. Here's another one. Just to let you know, give you a little challenge. This is an AIA Gold Medal Award winner design facility. And that handrail's at 36 inches. Okay? Non-compliant. It's too high. That little piece right in there, that's non-compliant. That's a protruding object. If I'm visually impaired and I'm walking with my cane, I can walk right in there. So you got to put something in there. We're putting up emergency defibrillators all over our buildings right now. Big, very popular thing to go on. Guess what? They are protruding objects unless you put them in the right spot. They can be a protruding object because they are deeper than 4 inches. You get into a gang toilet room, large toilet room, you've got all these devices, the hand dryers. This is a device to throw trash away in here and like that. Well, let's take a look at this. It's 5 inches deep. The bottom of the unit is 37.5. That makes that a protruding object. So be careful about these things. They can hit you without knowing it. Here's a little facility that's got a shelf. Okay? This happens to be at a clubhouse at a government entity that has a whole bunch of baseball fields. This is a concession stand. All right? Where's the top of this thing? It's at 36 inches, so that's good. The bottom's at 32, but that shelf looks a little bit deeper than 4 inches, doesn't it? That's a protruding object. That's a protruding object. That's going to hurt you. That TV is a protruding object. This happens to be at an airport. Oh, before I go any further, all these slides are real. They're not photoshopped. I want you to know that. If you see your project, please don't say anything, okay? Just acknowledge it, but don't go anywhere out there. What I love is this is at an airport, which I can't believe they just let the power cords just come down here to the outlet. Wow, I'm freaked out about that one. But that TV is a protruding object. When you put your TVs up on your walls, and we're all starting to do that, guess what? The average TV protrudes out more than 4 inches. That's why this railing is here at these monitors, because that's going to stop you from hitting it. They're down low enough, that prevents you from walking into it. But the depth of an average TV is about 6 to 7 inches. So when you start putting your TVs up in your corridors, be careful of that. Here's a facility. If you look at it architecturally, it's a large convention center, really kind of neat. Got all these, part of the structural members are at angles. Guess what? The angles were all protruding objects. Now, all these little shelves, and for tablets and everything, were not part of the original design. They were added after the lawsuit. So the original designer never thought about this. It didn't come up until the place got sued. Now they're all out there. There they are. Every area, because of that angled structural member. Chapter 4, accessible routes, walking surfaces. Okay, you need at least one accessible route from the property line, street, sidewalk, like that, to the front door. So you've got to get yourself there. You need from transportation stops, you need from parking, And the accessible route is from the accessible parking, because that's part of your accessible elements. And a passenger loading zone if you happen to have one. So let's take a look at this giant site plan here. I don't know if you saw the change on that. Let's go back. There it is. Now I draw it. Now there's all my accessible routes to get me through this campus. So in a college campus, this can get really kind of crazy for you. I got parking from the accessible route from the parking and dealing with it. Accessible routes are not required if no pedestrian route is provided. If circulation path is interior, accessible route must be interior. In other words, looked at a facility and did a review of one. They had a stage on the back of the building. They couldn't have access to the stage, so they made the accessible route to the stage outside the building, and then you got up to the stage. Can't do that. You got to do the same accessible route that everybody else goes. Can't go outside and go a different way. Accessible routes are not required to mezzanines, and buildings not required to have an elevator. That's an ADA issue. Under Florida law, you are required to have vertical accessibility to every level. New construction, you will provide vertical access to that mezzanine. Under the federal law, any building that's less than 3 stories or less than 3,000 square feet is not required to provide vertical accessibility. Not in Florida. Florida, back again, every level. And a level in Florida is defined as anything greater than 1/2 inch. Okay? So take a look at that. So there are some exceptions under the federal requirements, but as I mentioned to you, the accessible route requires upper story. If you got a medical, you got to do it. And again, just in Florida, folks, just more than 1 story, mezzanine, anything, raised areas, you're going to need to provide an accessible route to it. Yes?
Larry, the churches have traditionally been exempt from this. How are they covered under the new code?
Question was, churches in Florida, what's the requirement for accessibility for churches in Florida? Under the federal law, churches are exempt from accessibility compliance. There's an Attorney General's opinion that was put out there a couple of years ago that clarifies the issue that churches are exempt from the Florida Accessibility Code. Now, are you going to find the word churches are exempt in the Florida Accessibility Code? No. Now here's what the piece was. The Florida Accessibility Code used to say churches and private clubs are required to be accessible. When the battle came up about churches, and when it finally came to head, when someone said enough is enough because we couldn't agree on what to do for a church, what happened was the statutory language struck 2 words, churches and. So you can go to the old code way back when and see churches and private clubs, and then you will find out the word churches and got struck, so now it just says private clubs need to be made accessible in Florida. So basically, a church facility, and what it's been interpreted is the house of worship is not required to be made accessible. And there's an Attorney General's opinion on the webpage for the Attorney General. And at the Florida Building Commission, under their webpage on accessibility, they show the same document. So hopefully that will help you out a little bit. There's 2-story and 1-story, no public space. Again, these are the federal requirements, but let's talk about Florida's. Like I said, the traffic towers. This press boxes. Press boxes were always a big hot button because in a stadium, you had to make the press box for a high school, stuff like that, accessible. Now, what it says is that 500 square feet or less is the issue I'm dealing with. Basically, that's the main issue, but you have to go for a waiver under Florida law. Here's what Florida says about all of this stuff as it relates to press boxes. 206.2.7 press boxes. Press boxes in assembly areas shall be on an accessible route. Notwithstanding the requirements of the exceptions of the sections, shall Section 201 apply. Exceptions 1 and 2 are reserved, which means Florida took out those 2 exceptions, but they left in the explanation that Florida requirements may be waived down to the ADA standards, which means you have to go for a waiver for the press box. You'll get it, but you got to meet the requirements of the federal law. But you're still going to have to go through the process. And here's the advisory opinion, 206.27 press boxes, where a facility contains multiple areas, and just read exception number 2. The magic number, just think about it, is 500 square feet. So you can get it. It's not a problem. It doesn't have to be done all the time now. You just have to go for the waiver process. And that's the main thing dealing, same thing about this press boxes. The vertical accessibility, this is the big hot button in the state of Florida, always has been and always will be. Section Florida Statute 553509 mandates you have vertical accessibility. Unoccupiable spaces such as rooms, enclosed spaces, and storage spaces that are not designed for human occupancy, for public accommodations, or for work are exempt, i.e. warehouse, you got a second floor in a warehouse or a mezzanine that is strictly storage, that's exempt from vertical accessibility. Occupiable spaces and rooms that are not open to the public and that house no more than 5 persons, including but not limited to equipment control rooms and projection booths. Now, 5 people or less, not open to the public, but the important part is this has nothing to do when you go back to chapter 10 and 4 and figure out occupancy. So it doesn't mean a business occupancy where the building codes says body count is 1 per 100. It doesn't mean 500 square feet. The law just says 5 people. Not going back to occupancy count. That's an important part. Now, we recommend if you have a building department or a jurisdiction that maybe has a heartburn about this, talk to your client, have them sign an affidavit and give it to the building department. Then they've got something hopefully in their folder to answer that question. These are the ones that got added to the vertical accessibility. Theaters, concert halls, and stadiums or other large assembly areas that have stadium-style seating or tiered seating if sections 221 and 802 of the standards are met. You used to have vertical accessibility meant every level of a stadium, every level of stadium-style seating in a movie theater, and you had to go for a waiver. 99.9% of those waivers were granted. So now all you do is you follow what the code says. The federal law and the Florida law is exactly the same as it relates to the seating on dispersion, and if you do that, you've met that requirement. All play and recreational areas if the requirements of Chapter 10 of the standards are met. There have been some jurisdictions in Florida that mandated the top of a swimming pool, dive platform, be accessible. Under Chapter 10, you don't have to do that. All employee areas as exempted in 203.9 of the standards. So those employee areas under Section 203.9 are exemptions, and all facilities, sites, and spaces exempted by 203 of the standards. So everything under 203, those exceptions are now part of the exception of the Florida Accessibility Code. Except, if you noticed, the press boxes are Section 206. We missed that, in all honesty. Somehow we missed that section, and we're trying to get that corrected. The 203, here's the general exceptions. Raised areas, primary for purposes of security, life safety, or fire safety, including but not limited to observation or lookout galleries, prison guard towers, fire towers, lifeguard stands, things like that. That's part of the thing. Limited access spaces, machinery spaces, single occupancy structures. So just kind of go through yourself on looking at Section 203 and dealing with things that are out there. Detention, employee work areas, it's all kind of covered things. Raised areas, water slides, animal containment areas, the boxing and wrestling, diving boards, diving platforms. All those are now exempt from Florida's mandated vertical accessibility. Accessible means of egress, it's referenced into the ANSI standard, the International Building Code. So, and it references actually the 2003, Section 207. And here's the section under the older version. There's 2 choices you can pick, but Section 1007, accessible means of egress, the exception. This is existing facilities. Accessible means of egress are not required in alterations to existing buildings. So part of the Florida Accessibility Code takes you back to that. So you need to have the old codes in your hand if you can get one. However, Florida says this. Barriers at common or emergency entrances and exits. Barriers at common or emergency entrances and exits of business establishments conducting business with the general public that are existing, under construction, or under contract for construction, which prevent a person from using such entrances or exits shall be removed. Just want you to be aware of that. This requirement is under the Florida Accessibility Code. Entrances. The old code used to say half of the entrances need to be made accessible. Guess what? They now kicked it up to 60%. So now 60% of your entrances must comply. In addition to entrances required by 204, at least 60%, and you got, this is section 206.4.1 under the Florida Accessibility Code. So you've got that dealing with it. Clear width, path of travel for you when you walk around is something that's 36 inches wide. You're allowed to narrow it down to 32, like going down through a door. So you're allowed to have some projections in here because some people argue that a panic bar on a door was a projection and didn't let you through. So they've clarified a lot of these little things in here. You can have hardware between 34 and 38, no projections below 34 inches, so you can wheel yourself through for those who are chair users. Maneuvering spaces at the doors, they clarify. Look at the pictures, it's going to help you out a lot. But the pictures are just telling you what the text says, but the text overrides what it really does. So in dealing with all of that, again, the forward approach, you got to watch where your arrows are going. Then you need 18 inches clear on the pull side. If you're on the push side, you need 12 inches if the door has a closure and a latch. Otherwise, it's 0. So think about a bathroom door that you normally just push it open. You got a push plate and a pull plate. If I just push it, there is no clearance requirements on the push side. It goes to 0 because there's nothing to stop you. Okay? Now if the door has, see, remember, it's a closure and a latch, not just one or the other. You have to have both of those. Maneuvering clearances on the doors is measured from the wall. Okay? Now there's another interesting thing that we always had a debate about. You got a big thick wall. How thick is thick before you need to meet the clearances? Well, they've come up with the magic number. It's 8 inches. So from the face of the door to the outside of the wall, if it's greater than 8 inches, then you need all your clearances at the door. So just be careful of that piece if that runs into it. And here's the example. Doors recessed greater than 8 inches deep, maneuvering clearance for a forward approach. Okay? Remember? So a block wall, you can make it work. You do block and brick, and depending on where you put the frame, you could have a problem. So again, that depth right there, 8 inches maximum. If you do that, then you got to recess it and put it all back in there.